Hello, hello, hello. Welcome, welcome, welcome. This is a day like no other. My name is Angela Robertson, and it is my pleasure to take you through today's program. I know that this is a reunion as well. So in Stephen fashion, he has brought us together once more for memory sharing, for laughter, for tears, but also remembering remarkable work done. So we know very well that this day is a must for all of us. But there are people in our lives for whom we want this day's arrival delayed as long as possible. This is the case for this husband, father, brother, grandfather, friend, teacher, politician, diplomat, force of nature, and good troublemaker, Stephen Lewis. And the good troublemaker is another Lewis that was the John Lewis from the US, who was also another Lewis, but a good troublemaker. We gather here in Toronto, 1,200 strong, and thousands online from across Canada and around the world. Thank you for gathering, particularly those from the 54 countries in Africa and the many grandmothers groups here and abroad gathered to celebrate a life lived with purpose and urgency. We grieve Stephen passing as we gather to honor his social justice work and political leadership in fighting the HIV/AIDS epidemic, to applaud Stephen's use of his privilege to speak out against structural adjustment and inequality. And we're thankful that he founded the Stephen Lewis Foundation to improve the material conditions of many impacted by HIV and AIDS. We must also remember right here that he produced the 1992 Stephen Lewis Report on Race Relations in Ontario, commissioned by Premier Bob Rae following what I call the Yonge Street riots and rebellion. They say the riots, we say the rebellion. A report that identified systemic anti-Black racism as a pervasive issue in policing, education, and employment. And this report continues to be referenced in the continuing work to address those long-standing injustices. The program you have today will take you through that journey of Stephen's work. And the program you have today is also very much Stephen's creation. As in true Stephen Lewis fashion, he provided details and directions about what actions needed to be taken after his passing. So my partner would say this is Stephen's curated event. So here we are at yet another Stephen Lewis gathering. And the only things missing are Stephen's grand eloquence, his resonant analysis, and call to action for social change. However, you will get variations of this from the reflections of many shared by friends, colleagues, and family. If you are in the city of Toronto tonight, and it may be broadcasted as well for those who aren't here, but if you're in the city and you look south, you will see the CN Tower bathed in orange. Yes? It's campaign time, it's coming. It's coming, people. There's a campaign ahead, yes? So tonight you will see the CN Tower bathed in orange, arranged by Toronto's Mayor Olivia Chow. As a symbol of Stephen Lewis's past leadership in an affinity with the NDP and social democratic politics in this country and beyond. So we will be moving through the program, and you have it in, if you haven't, share with a friend. We will not be introducing folks as they come up. We will just follow the kind of the lineup from the program you have with you. And for those who are needing ASL services, they are here. Please position yourself or ask to be positioned in a space where you can see. And for those online, there will be closed caption in the post-production video that will be shared. It is now my pleasure, and the only introduction that I will do, to bring up the president of Toronto Metropolitan University, Mohamed Lachmi. Thank you.
Good morning, bonjour tout le monde. On behalf of our students, staff, and faculty, welcome to Toronto Metropolitan University. Toronto is the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans and all newcomers, have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Nous sommes très ravis à l'Université métropolitaine de Toronto de vous accueillir au sein de notre campus pour célébrer la vie d'un grand Canadien. I want to express my condolences from our university community to the family and the many friends and colleagues of Stephen Lewis. We are honored to host this memorial at TMU, where Stephen served as a distinguished visiting professor. It is difficult to adequately describe what Stephen brought to this role. The richness of his experience, the humanity that he demonstrated in every interaction, his passion for social justice, his humility. Our students knew they were lucky to have Stephen sharing his thoughts and time with them. In turn, Stephen loved the curiosity and the diversity of our students. On a personal level, the name of Stephen Lewis is well known in my household. All my 4 children graduated from Stephen Lewis Secondary School in Mississauga, and they all know and understand his legacy. For myself, African-born and Canadian by choice, there was an obvious connection with Stephen. The work he did in Africa for the most vulnerable, combating HIV/AIDS, investigating genocide, supporting grandmothers in community work, studying the impact of armed conflict on children. All of these were representations of his compassion and his eternal optimism that brings everything he did. Africans knew and loved him. When I went to South Africa in 2016, in my role as a president, I heard 2 names mentioned time and again when my various hosts, including government officials, find out I was Canadian. One name was Brian Mulroney, and the other one was Stephen Lewis, who together found a common purpose in fighting apartheid. 25 years ago, exactly 25 years ago, we honored Nelson Mandela and his wife in this room with an honorary doctorate. And I can tell you the person who convinced them to accept an honorary doctorate in a Canadian university here was Stephen Lewis. And I want really to recognize that. Prior to his international work, Stephen served for more than 7 years as the leader of the Ontario New Democratic Party. There is a coincidental connection between this institution and Stephen's successful campaign to become leader of the NDP in 1970. His main opponent in that context was Walter Pittman, who was run up to Stephen on the final leadership ballot, and who, a few years later, became the much beloved president of this university. Among Stephen's many skills was his ability to recognize potential in people. Actually, I was reading an article yesterday in the Globe, and I think Avi was mentioning that he had a lot of hidden skills. One of them is really to recognize potential in people. It was 2015 when he suggested I contact someone he thought would be future star in the country, and he tried to convince me to bring him to TMU Horizon at that time. I followed his advice and arranged to connect with Webb New, who I am pleased, I know that he was supposed to be with us, but due to emergency situation, he's not able. He's now the Premier of Manitoba, so I could not convince him to come to TMU. I would like to conclude by reading the final paragraph of a personal message that Stephen sent me in 2018 when his tenure here as Professor of Distinction was coming to a close. Stephen said, "I have taught at 3 universities. The Ryerson sojourn over its many years was the most satisfying. I have never thought of myself as a professor of distinction. I don't even have a degree, but I did think of myself as someone who was part of an academic community, where students learn that improving the human condition and fighting for social justice were perhaps the most noble objectives of all." Stephen Lewis lived a life of noble objectives, as well as a profound impact. And for that, we can all be truly grateful. I am honored to have known him and count him as a colleague here at TMU, but most importantly, as a mentor. Thank you very much.
And it takes but a minute. Digger donkeys and fry, my thoughts freely flower. Digger donkeys and fry, my thoughts give me power. No scholar can map them, no hunter can trap them, no man can deny. Dear donkeys and fry, no man can deny. Dear donkeys and fry, I think as I please, and this gives me pleasure. My conscience decrees that right I must treasure. My thoughts will not cater to duke or dictator. No man can deny. Dear donkeys and fry, no man can deny. Dear donkeys and fry, should tyrants take me and throw me in prison, my thoughts will burst free like blossoms in seasons. Foundations will crumble and structures will tumble, and free men will cry, Digger Donkin, say fry. Stephen Lewis did cry. My thoughts are free.
Only Stephen could do this to me. It's really good to see so many familiar faces here, and also to know how many of our friends and allies are online as we celebrate Stephen. And I came here determined not to mourn Stephen, but to celebrate him. I want us to celebrate his passionate belief in justice, in fairness, that was really rooted in love of people. And I wanted us to celebrate the man who took the privileges that this world had given him and used them to stand in solidarity with the people that the world wished to marginalize. I want us to celebrate the man who refused to bow down to all those people who would prefer us to maintain the status quo, no matter how unfair, unjust, and wrong that status quo could be. And I personally want to celebrate the man who truly saw and listened and heard people. There have been so many times as an African woman, myself and so many of my sisters here and elsewhere, where we've walked into decision-making rooms and you see people look behind you to kind of see, oh, when are the real participants coming in? Never with Stephen. He saw, he listened, he heard. And in a world where so many people use rhetoric as a shield to hide fear, to hide complacency, to hide inertia, I want to celebrate a man whose genius with words was used to hold us accountable, to speak truth to power, no matter how uncomfortable that became, either for him or for others. And whose words weren't rhetoric because they were a precursor to action. And that genius with words, I'm sure many of you have been here when he has eviscerated people. But he also used those words to make you laugh until you cried, because he could be so, so funny. And sometimes both things were happening at the same time. The Stephen that's in my heart and mind right now is the one who, when many years ago, working with the UN, had been told that children who'd been kidnapped by a militia group had finally been located. And then he was told, absolutely unequivocally, by the powers that be, that it would be too complicated to go and release those children. And the man who knew how to listen suddenly developed a really strong case of not hearing. And he used all of his networks. He used his personal and social and political cachet to reach out and find the people who could help to move those children. And those children were moved to safety. Of course, after that had been done, nobody wanted to push him too hard on the how that happened. A lot of people took credit, though, but that's a different thing. So I really want all of us to celebrate the Stephen, who is the UN Special Envoy on HIV/AIDS in Africa, pushed governments, pushed presidents, pushed leaders of all kinds to stop ignoring the HIV/AIDS crisis in Africa and start taking action to turn the tide of that really devastating pandemic. And the man who, at the same time as haranguing these political and civil and religious leaders, had the vision and the clarity and the commitment to listen to the voices and the ideas of African youth and African grandmothers. He had the sight to be able to see the impact that African grandmothers were having and the work that African grandmothers were doing to hold together a continent that was being hollowed out by death. And when it was clear that there weren't enough resources getting to those community activists, getting to those grandmothers, getting to those communities, he came back to Canada and with his daughter Ilana, set up the Stephen Lewis Foundation, not to rescue Africa and Africans, but to generate the financial support needed to scale the HIV/AIDS response at community level. His belief in collective action, which we've seen throughout his life in his passionate commitment to trade unionism, his understanding that change came from the people and not from political hierarchies, meant that the foundation did an incredible thing. It raised resources, it channeled them to the activists working at community level, and it stood alongside and behind the activists. I'm going to say that again, alongside and behind, because this was solidarity. It was not charity, it was not patronization, it was not rescue, it was solidarity. And speaking of family, I want to celebrate Stephen's amazing family who are all here. And especially you, Michelle. I can't actually see. I know you're there somewhere. I remember a time when Jennifer Clott, who's here somewhere today, and myself were trying to wrap up the final version of the report on the children in armed conflict. And as we got closer and closer to our deadline, we'd get inspiration and guidance from Mama Graça Machel in South Africa. And she was the expert who was leading the study and who became a friend, a co-conspirator, and family to Stephen while they were doing that work and far beyond. Jennifer and I would work crazy hours of the night and then send all these reworked pages to Stephen. Now, Stephen was meant actually to be on a family holiday. And every morning, Jennifer and I would find pages and pages of edited brilliance spooling out of this fax machine. And yes, it was that long ago that we had fax machines. Jennifer and I were absolutely certain that, Michelle, you would never forgive us. So thank you, Michelle, and the whole of your family for so generously sharing this incredible man with the world and with us. And also, thank you for your own unflinching, holistic, visionary feminism that aligned, empowered, and strengthened the light that Stephen brought to this world. And two final things. First of all, gratitude for a man who actually was not scared of women. And who was strong enough and caring enough and strategic enough to see and work with really powerful women. There are so many of us that Stephen mentored, amplified, and care about. Many of us in this room today, and many more in the world today. His legacy will live on in his family, in the millions of people who are alive today because of his interventions and support to HIV/AIDS activists. It'll live on in those of us in Canada, in different parts of Africa, and different parts of the world. So let's not mourn Stephen. Let's celebrate him. In this world of far too many venal, short-sighted, selfish leaders lacking even the smallest understanding of integrity, Stephen's light will be so missed. And so, let us celebrate him. Let us celebrate everything about him, his humor, his seriousness, his anger, his belief, his ability to motivate. Let us celebrate his leadership so that new generations of activists can be inspired by leadership rather than repulsed by it. Hope Chigudu, a very wise African feminist and a friend to Stephen, myself, to the foundation, wrote to me to say that Stephen's work was done and now we should let him rest. I like to think that Ghana, my home country, left little seeds within Stephen's life from his early visits there. And so in the words of my Ga ancestors, Stephen, Wojogban, sleep well.
I agree with Theo. Stephen introduced himself to me out of the blue at the University of Toronto on a Sunday night in October 1956. And he asked me out of the blue if I'd like to, after this meeting, go to another meeting with him, a meeting of what proved to be the University of Toronto's CCF NDP club. I was the 5th member. We bonded immediately, and he was soon referring to me as his alter ego, which was perfect since nobody understood what that meant. There's not enough time to talk about our lifetime commitment to causes together or to do justice to the cherished friendship we had over that lifeline. Let me start with my first and probably least known story. In the summer of 1957, when most of you still weren't around, as 19-year-olds, we traveled with a friend to Little Rock, Arkansas, to support the civil rights movement fighting for the integration of the high school there. Afterwards, we traveled to Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, the heart of racism in the United States, speaking to journalists and black farm workers about the racism in their daily life. This beginning became the basis of a lifetime of heartfelt friendship and work together on social justice issues. I need to skip over dozens of other adventures. Let me move to when Stephen became leader of the Ontario NDP and asked me to work along with him with a team, as well as a team of brilliant researchers that he assembled. He ended up, Merritt, forgive me, being the best opposition leader the province but you have time. Maybe the country itself has ever seen. As one headline in the Globe and Mail put it, razor sharp in the legislature, warm and witty on the hustings. Now, we don't say that about many politicians. His lifetime of dazzling oratory and wicked sense of humor was on full display in these years. As one reporter wrote about Stephen, he used with precision a profuse vocabulary that sent many listeners scamping for a dictionary. We can all relate to that. Electoral success eluded us, it wasn't to be, but for Stephen there was still a world of change to champion and fight for. Others will or have spoken to his outspoken time as UN ambassador and at UNICEF, where our lives intersected often and we worked together frequently. But in the short time remaining, I want to speak about his outstanding work on the Rwandan genocide. A grisly way to deal with Sunday, but what the heck. I got a call on a quiet Sunday morning from Stephen. Carol and I were just relaxing, but he was excited about having been appointed to a high-level Africa Union commission into the Rwanda genocide. His call wasn't just to share his feeling of honor at this remarkable appointment. He told me that the commission needed a writer, and as it happens so many other times throughout our 70 years, he said, "Jerry, you need to be that writer. You must come. I need you by the end of the week. By the way, I'm in Ethiopia." And he was, and soon so was I. When the African Union decided that there must be an African report on the genocide, they included Stephen on their panel because he was embraced as a true friend of Africa at the UN. As with everything else he had done in his life, he was always on the side of total honesty on the world's complete failure to prevent this preventable genocide. As always, he fought for the truth, as grotesquely ugly as it was. And as a true friend of Africa, Stephen remained until the very end of his life, as all the grandmothers' chapters out there can attest to. Others will speak to those wonderful grassroots organizations of women more fully, but grandmothers remain close to his heart and the fight against AIDS until the very end. I only wish I had time to describe in a dozen other ways how he adored Michelle and his family, leaned on them for support throughout his life, and gloried in every one of their successes. We didn't have an election campaign in which his kids didn't come along. Stephen, old pal, once he got sick, we used to kid each other about which one of us would do the other's eulogy. Goodbye, old friend. Part of me is sorry to have won this debate.
Like all of you, I was in awe of Stephen Lewis. I saw him seamlessly navigate from politics to academics, from labor organizer to political party organizer, from orator to author, from diplomat to humanitarian crusader, from international visionary to international rescuer. I saw dozens of honors, including the Companion of the Order of Canada, and 42 honorary degrees. I saw him transform national and global policy with his bewitching eloquence, and I saw him transcend partisan politics when the public interest required collaborative engagement. So here's the one thing about him that bewildered me, the one that made no sense to me in an otherwise flawless professional trajectory. He wasn't a lawyer. How could someone without a law degree possibly navigate the singular interstices of injustice that he had dedicated his life to addressing? But he not only could, he did. And he did it so magisterially and charismatically that he became one of Canada's greatest justice gifts to the world. To him, it was not just about the law. It was about making the law work for the people, by the people, and of the people, so that it never lost sight of its purpose, to connect people to justice. In fact, I see Stephen Lewis's life story as the emblematic story of justice leadership in our generation's trajectory towards an ever-widening understanding of what human rights are, and why they are indispensable to democracy's ability to stay democratic, humanity's ability to stay humane, and civil society's ability to stay civil. His whole life represented a tribute to the values of a healthy, flourishing democracy, and he was our Canadian and global democratic tribune for dignity and compassion. For him, human rights was not left-wing politics, it was mainstream, right in the middle. Right in the middle of what makes a society fair and decent. I'm sure that much of his passionate commitment to human rights came from a genetic predisposition that he's passed on to Ilana, Avi, and Jenny, and his wonderful grandchildren. But I also think some of it might have flowed inexorably from the fact that he was born in 1937, 2 years before World War II started, when the world was introduced what turned out to be the most rights-repressive rebuke to democracy and to dignity that the world had ever known. We saw people and ideas we had cherished being cavalierly destroyed, and we saw how easily the destruction had been enabled and appeased. I think the fact that we miraculously emerged victorious from that brutal assault on our freedom and our humanity helped create a preternatural thirst in Stephen for ensuring that the future was insulated from both rights abuses and from the unforgivable indifference that led to them. Whatever the inspiration, he became a human rights juggernaut who led our generation's boisterous rights parade into the future. His touchstones were the vulnerable, and his mission was to attenuate their vulnerability. He embraced, among others, feminism, labor rights, children's rights, reproductive rights, gender identity rights, and indigenous rights. He decried racism, the unconscionable inadequacy of the response to the climate crisis, to AIDS in Africa, to rape and torture victims in Rwanda and globally, and to victims of armed conflict everywhere. He was fearless in both rhetoric and conduct, wise in strategy, and yet somehow perpetually optimistic that the combination of indefatigable commitment and advocacy could and would rectify whatever injustice he was confronting. More often than not, his optimism and perseverance were vindicated. But I think we can safely assume that while he must have felt enormous pride at the many progressive waves and tributaries of rights that he had launched, nurtured, and protected, he was also witnessing too many regressive ones, increasingly blocking the flow. Too much discrimination, too much intolerance, too much hate. These were the conceptual adversaries he had spent his life confronting, because these were the conceptual barriers to the values of compassion and fairness he had spent his life promoting. They are also, as a result, the conceptual barriers his legacy requires the rest of us to continue to confront, perhaps without the benefit of his mellifluous, multisyllabic rhetorical arsenal, but guided by the memory of his belief in our better natures and a better world. I end with this observation about Stephen's life. In everything I have discussed, in all of his time as a justice warrior and avatar, he was, at all times, one half of a true and luminous partnership with Michelle. Together, they patrolled the universe with brilliant vision and unshakable integrity, and held up the social and political mirror for the rest of us so that we could see ourselves and continuously ask, are we the fairest of them all? That partnership, the remarkable family they created together, the love they gave and absorbed from each other, that is where Stephen got the endless supply of emotional and intellectual nourishment that filled his brain and heart with hope and turned a whole generation into his moral disciples. He was a friend, he was an inspiration, he was a hero, he was a mensch, and he was also the only Jewish saint I knew. How lucky we were that he chose to donate his life to making ours better.
In the midst of hate, I found there was within me an invincible love. In the midst of tears, I found there was within me an invincible joy. In the midst of chaos, I found there was within me an invincible calm. I realized through it all that in the midst of winter, there was within me an invincible summer. It says that no matter how hard the world pushes against me, within me, there's something stronger, something better, always pushing back.
Allow me to take this moment to invite millions of comrades who have joined online from Cape Town to Cairo, from Morocco to Madagascar. But I also want to invite Stephen's spirit to be present today and forever. I come from a region that appreciates those who have passed because they live in us. I have no doubt that Stephen is here, watching and listening to some of the truths that we are going to say and the words we are going to mince. He will remind us when we sleep at night that we did not speak all the truth. Allow me then to misbehave, just like Stephen, and invite all those like Winston Zulu who wished they were here, all those who have passed, to also come and be present amongst us. Today we celebrate a life, an amazing human being. We honor a fallen giant today. I would like then to take this moment to allow us, give ourselves permission to not only say the things that are right or feel good and make ourselves uncomfortable. And with that, I seek Stephen's permission to not let us sit like stiff people and sing and dance and release, because for me, in order for my tears to not keep flowing, I need to release it in the best ways I could. I wish I could sing with you, not alone. I wish I could dance with you in order for Stephen to see the true of what we are and what he had experienced when he came to visit us in South Africa. I wanted to start that way to allow Stephen to know that, yes, we will allow you, comrade, to rest in peace, but your spirit should multiply through us. As we gather today, yes, we have heavy hearts, but we also have deep gratitude for Stephen's life, deep gratitude to Michelle, who really has showed us that he can intimidate a white man to know his place. Unapologetically, consistently, I have been watching Michelle taking Stephen through an education and a university of life. Michelle, my dear comrade, I wish many of those who have not gone through your school of feminism in this room need to start registering today. Stephen did many, many amazing things. He was a comrade, he was a mentor, he was a friend to many of us, but above all, he was a fierce force that moved alongside African women like me. As Theo said, Stephen never was in front or above us. Stephen was alongside us. Stephen struggled and worked with us together on the struggle to access to medicines, particularly people like me who would not be standing here today after 27 years living longer. Hopefully, one day I will also rest during the old age of Stephen's time because of what the type of work that he represented. Stephen understood power, and also he understood that power comes with responsibility. Those of us in the room and many who are online who have power, use that power responsibly in the service of humanity. That's what Stephen did. He was a man fully aware that he cannot willingly be defined by his privilege. Yes, the world expects white men who are privileged to behave in a particular way. Stephen instead chose to use that privilege to kick doors. He used that privilege to amplify voices like mine. He stood with us. He made us visible, while the world made us invisible and undesirable. Sounds very familiar, right? It's happening today. He did not center himself. I, the leader, look at me, hear me. No, that's not what Stephen did. He centered the struggles of millions of people with no power and no privilege. So we must reflect on ourselves when we live here. What are we going to do with our power and our privilege and center the people who the world today is deeming undesirable? Stephen stood shoulder to shoulder with many comrades from Treatment Action Campaign in their most critical moments, when no one wanted to wear this T-shirt that I'm wearing today, when no one wanted to be associated with people living with HIV, when no one wanted to stand with transgender people, when no one wanted to stand with men who have sex with men, when no one wanted to stand with sex workers, when no one wanted to stand with people who use drugs. Stephen stood with us. That was the period when many people in the world wanted to turn a blind eye. They wanted to walk away from the African problem. And that was the AIDS crisis. Sounds very familiar, right? Am I talking about a world of 20 years? Sounds like it. I've lived through it. It's happening today. It is happening today. When silence is deadly, when an HIV diagnosis like mine meant a death sentence, our Stephen refused to look away. He refused not just to be, but he used his English. Sometimes I wonder, did Stephen make up those words? Stephen was violent in his use of language. He used that violence against a violent system that used English to alienate people. He spoke courageously. He spoke unapologetically. He spoke seriously violent language. He confronted a violent injustice with its violent English. I met Stephen in my early 20s. I was very young. Stephen saw potential. His friend really said it in very beautiful words, that Stephen saw potential. Sometimes when we do not even see that potential in ourselves, Stephen saw potential. In my first encounter, I understood something about this man. In the boardrooms, Stephen did not soften his words. Some of the violent language in the meetings where I have been, when there were no people who were causing violence, he was not violent. He was the softest, the most funny person I have ever met. But do not try Stephen when people refuse to listen. Stephen used those words in ways that I didn't even know where they came from. They felt like bullets. He made people feel uncomfortable. He carried conviction, moral clarity, making it hard to ignore what is at stake. He was there on the streets with us. He did not allow this distance between people and leadership. He was there in the court battles. He was there in the most difficult times when Winston Zulu was sick, dying of AIDS. He did not distance himself from that pain. He confronted that pain. He sat in that pain. He was there when we were killed by AIDS denialism that costed many, many of our lives. Stephen chose truth and action. He stood firm for science. He understood that gender equality is a must. It is not an afterthought. He understood that fundamental human rights are critical. Not often do you meet comrades who can speak truth to power, but equally have ability to listen. Oh my goodness, we have a listening deficit in leadership. We have a serious chronic listening deficit in leadership. Stephen came down to the grassroots women across generations, not just to the grandmothers. He came to my generation in my early 20s. He still continued to engage across generations. He came and listened to women. Women who were the backbone of the AIDS response that was killing Our mothers were bearing us at a very early age. Stephen stood with those women. Women like Mam Zodwa, may her soul rest in peace. Mama Dalina, who buried their own children, and without a pause, without a rest, just like Avi, they had to pick up their spears, wear their boots back on the ground, and went to organize to pick up those children that were left orphans. There was no time to rest. Through that work, Stephen, as already shared by Theo, is that Stephen used his power and privilege and went and came back to Canada to found the Stephen Lewis Foundation. I won't say too much about the foundation. I think Theo has already said, and I don't have enough time. He listened. He followed those grandmothers' leadership. He did not lead them. They led. Stephen was in the background. He insisted that the world must see who is the backbone of the AIDS response in Africa. These women were not centered by Stephen as victims, they were centered as leaders. Stephen believed deeply in us. He expected, though, all of us to act. He did not just give us free love, free activism, free leadership. He is expecting us, those of us who are in the room, I'm sorry, this is not free. He expects us to challenge complacency. He expects us to not have neutrality or impartiality in the face of injustice. We still are facing more than 600,000 people dying of AIDS. When we have all the tools, what is wrong with us? What is wrong with us? People in Africa and in Asia dying of TB, a preventable and a curable disease, as a #1 cause of death today. Shame on us. Young children, infants who are born from underserved rural women in Africa, bearing their children due to malaria when we have the tools. Shame on us. In 2026, that is not acceptable. That is what Stephen is expecting me to say to make you feel uncomfortable. The struggle continues. Now it is up to us. When silence feels easy, find your courage to act. Defend life's dignity without compromise today. That is what Stephen is leaving us to act on. Now, in closing, Stephen must rest in power, but we do not want to let his bones not to speak. I invite Stephen's bones to really become that fire beneath our feet when we leave this room, and not say that was a beautiful memorial service. No, this is not for TikTok, this is not for Twitter, not for trending. It is meant to cause uncomfortability in our feet, for us to do something. If you have the resources, put it in the Stephen Lewis Foundation. If the country of Canada can and still believe in global solidarity, put your resources in the Global Fund. Let's all not give up, not today. We can't. Now I'm going to ask my comrades who are online and the comrades in the room to raise their fists. I'm going to do what Stephen is expecting me to do. Raise your fists. May that fist be your commitment to do something. Long live the spirit of Stephen Lewis Foundation. Long live. Long live the spirit of Stephen Lewis. Long live. Long live the spirit of Stephen Lewis. Long live. Amandla. Amandla. That is your commitment to act. Thank you.
I knew of Stephen Lewis long before I ever met him, though like all of us here, my life is so much richer for having crossed paths with his. I cut my teeth as an HIV/AIDS queer activist in the late 80s, early 90s in the US at a time when my community lost an entire generation of men. In those days, the fire of our rage was stoked by the knowledge that so much more could have been done to prevent it if our government saw us as worth saving. That there was always money for war, for resource extraction, for globalization, for attacks on artists and academics and activists, and that the choice around who lives and who dies rested in the hands of a few elites. We saw the pandemic emerging, but the scale of the catastrophe was made human, and those elites held accountable by Stephen Lewis. I met Stephen Lewis first in his words, hearing his lectures on AIDS in Africa, likely on the CBC, and when he said, "I have spent the last 4 years watching people die," my heart contracted in anguished recognition. He was also, as others have noted, perhaps the only speaker I've ever heard that had me looking up words to ensure I caught his meaning. But he also never made me feel small or excluded for my lack of knowledge. This was certainly part of his magic as an orator. No one could invite an audience in and hold them the way that he could, even if he was calling them out and speaking truth to power. It would be another few decades before I actually met Stephen, this time as the president of APSU CEFPO, a union that honored him with the Stanley Knowles Humanitarian Award in 2001. And I gotta let you know, he beat out one heck of a roster of nominees. That included Maud Barlow, Stanley Grizel, Leonard Peltier, Doctors Without Borders, and that speaks to his direct ties to workers as a democratic socialist, to be honest. We may have been the first union to support the Stephen Lewis Foundation when it was formed in 2003. But labor unions across Canada responded to Stephen's call to action around fighting AIDS. That's because Stephen made hundreds of thousands of workers in Canada see their shared humanity with African people dying of AIDS, not through pity or sentimentality, but by bearing unflinching witness and by going after the pharmaceutical companies behaving at their exploitative capitalist worst. Stephen's legacy, frankly, is his ability to remind each of us that global politics and economics cannot be separated from their direct impact on workers, and that workers' issues cannot be extricated from social justice fights at any scale. That we exist as whole workers and must be treated as full human beings, not as resources to be extracted by greedy corporations or callous governments bent on profiteering. What underlies his legacy, these talents, this remarkable life, however, was an irrepressible curiosity and passion for engagement and learning. Look around us at this room, comrades. Look at the communities that he has built. He was unwaveringly adherent to struggles for justice and his belief in the inherent value of human life. He never ceased to evolve. As late as last year, he was standing on the streets of Scarborough demonstrating against the genocide in Gaza. Standing in solidarity with workers, for our environment, for women, for peace, Stephen Lewis asked us to join together in creating a world worth living for, because the dream and responsibility of democratic socialists is the making of a world in which justice and equality are all that our children ever know. And as Stephen said, that is why we never give up. So let us honor our comrade in our unrelenting pursuit of that promise. May you rest in power, Stephen. We'll take it from here.
bless the Honorable Stephen Lewis. This apparently was one of his absolute favorite songs that we're sharing with you. My life goes on in endless song above earth's lamentation. I hear the real, though far off hymn that hails the new creation. Above the tumult and the strife, I hear the music singing. It sounds an echo in my soul. How can I keep from singing? What though the tempest loudly roars, I hear the truth, it liveth. What though the darkness soundly close, songs in the night it giveth. No storm can shake my inmost calm, while to the rock I'm clinging, since love is head, since love is Lord of heaven and earth. How can I keep from singing? My eyes are dim, I cannot see. We go to the when triumphs tremble, sick with fear, and hear the death note ringing. When friends rejoice, both far and near, how can I keep from singing? In prison cell and death dungeons vile, our thoughts to them are winging. When friends from shame are undefiled, how can I keep from singing? How can I keep from singing? Stephen's soul is singing.
In a time of 24-hour news cycles when yesterday's stories become stale, it's been deeply rewarding to see and hear the tributes to Stephen for weeks after his death. A reflection of the enormous esteem with which he is held. You've heard it all already. Every one of us here and countless people around the world will keep him alive in our memories. It's been our great privilege to have known him or known of him in some way that has touched us, inspired us, and changed us for the better. The measure of anyone's time on earth is not in wins and losses, in successes or failures or accumulated wealth, but in the values by which they lived and acted. For me, my mother was the person who most epitomized the values of love, family, humility, generosity, and hard work, and I've tried to emulate that with varying degrees of success. If all of humanity lived by her values, what a different world we would have. But she, like most of humanity, was humble and invisible, destined to disappear without a trace in 2 generations. And that is why Stephen is so important to me. He represented so many of the values I most admire, and through the addition of his brilliant intelligence, his eloquence and charisma, was able to have a powerfully positive global impact. I am so proud to have called him a friend. I'm so proud he was Canadian. I'm so proud of his championship of workers and the poor. I am so proud of his love of Africa and its people and the enormous impact he had on apartheid and on the HIV/AIDS crisis on that continent. I'm so proud of the work he did on the environment, especially in his landmark chairing of the Toronto Conference on the Changing Atmosphere in 1988. That is why he must remain an inspiration in every corner of our culture, a beacon for every generation to see what can be achieved by one person without compromising his values. I believe his greatest achievement was in enticing Michelle to create a rich life partnership in which synergy produced far more than the sum of their individual contributions. His daughters, Jenny and Ilana, reinforced the feminism in his family, while Avi represents the incarnation of Stephen's political hopes. I believe Stephen hung on in the last weeks of his life. Just he was waiting to hear what the NDP leadership vote was going to be. I was elated that he lived long enough to hear that Avi had won. But I have to admit, when I heard that he had won, there was a moment when I thought, oh my God, Stephen's going to want to live to campaign for him. Avi is his political legacy, and I, for one, will devote myself to Stephen by supporting Avi in the coming years. After Stephen had had surgery for an old football injury, who would believe that, I got a call from Avi. My dad is going nuts with boredom. Is there anything you can do to give him some interest? And so, as a result, I got Stephen to talk to me for an hour each time about his life. Once or twice a week, 2 silverbacks would explore his incredible experiences, and I now have 22 riveting hours that will make a great series. You see, my greatest hope is that Stephen's life, his speeches, his writing, will be a fundamental core of every Canadian child's education, not only for the uplifting values he stood for, but for the admirable courage and honesty, for his generous intelligence, his unparalleled eloquence, and unfailing determination with which he fought for them. Stephen Lewis lived a noble life, and in doing so, he ennobled all of Canada. Thank you.
I would suggest that you not pretend that I'm Wab Canoe. But if you were to, their legislations, I would pass. So as you heard, Wab wasn't able to make it, family emergency. So these are his words to Stephen. Stephen Lewis was a legend. Growing up on the Ojibwe, Omigwe Gaming First Nations, a reserve in northwestern Ontario, my parents would speak of the mystic Stephen Lewis. My dad was just a year older than Stephen, and when my dad turned 70, we had planned a surprise birthday party for him. To get my dad to show up for the surprise party, we made up this story that Stephen Lewis was speaking in Winnipeg. We tricked him into coming to the basement of the Clarion Hotel. Everyone shouts, "Surprise!" He's expecting Stephen Lewis, the orator. At the end of my dad's birthday party, and entirely seriously, my dad says, "When is Stephen Lewis coming to speak?" When Stephen was at Queen's Park, my family was on the front lines fighting for civil liberties and human rights in the Treaty 3 region of northwestern Ontario. My late father, Tobino Squat, and I apologize if I did the mispronunciation. That's me, Angela, speaking. And my Uncle Fred served as political leaders for our people, serving as chief and grand chief. Stephen stood with them. He took their fight to question period as leader of the opposition. He carried it to the United Nations as ambassador. He made sure their voices were heard locally, nationally, and globally. He highlighted their struggles in local and national media, saying in 1976, "My God, they've succeeded to us for 400 years. Why can't we accede to them for 6 months?" I first met Stephen in 2014 through Canada Reads. We spent a lot of time together that week. He challenged me to enter politics, and he challenged me to do it with his party. Stephen is the reason I am a New Democrat. Me too. Stephen supported me through controversies. He even promising to send his brother Michael to run my first campaign in 2016. Michael, I'm not sure if you knew that. For the past decade in politics, Stephen supported me. After I was elected premier in 2023, the first time that's happened to a kid from an Indian reserve in Canada, I called Mr. Lewis. I called Mr. Lewis and thanked him for helping me to make it possible. The last time I spoke to Stephen in early March of this year, he said, "Forgive me because I'm at the end of my life and I get emotional. But for those of us who are democratic socialists and have been working for decades to help the needy, the disabled, and those who have less, go represent what is best in life." So to Stephen, we will, all of us who you inspire in politics and social justice. To Michelle and the family, we send you our sincere condolences. To honor him, we will establish a postdoctoral fellowship in HIV research in Stephen Lewis's name. So that future Manitobians and Canadians will live to his challenge, represent what is best in life. Miigwech, thank you.
Sure, you go. Why not?
I'm using the Apple box. Okay. Hello, everyone. I am Stephen's son, Avi. I'd like to start by extending a heartfelt thank you to all the incredible speakers today. It's been so powerful to hear you all touch some of the notes from the many movements of Dad's life. We are here on behalf of the family. My mom, Michelle Landsberg, Dad's soulmate, great love, co-conspirator, sounding board, apparently university registrar, and everyday interlocutor in a conversation that rounded every bend like a fast-running river for 63 years. Dad's siblings, Michael Lewis, Janet Solberg, and Anita Liebeskind, who have lost their eldest, and I know are in deepest mourning, missing even the occasional episodes they endured of irritable brother syndrome. To finish the program today, you're going to hear from Stephen's kids, me and my sisters, Ilana, who among many other accomplishments, as you heard, co-founded the Stephen Lewis Foundation with Dad, and Jenny, who was the casting director for a little TV show called Heated Rivalry. I'm a proud brother, sue me. Many of you know that the final months of Dad's journey coincided with my campaign for the leadership of Canada's NDP, our lifelong political home. And for those of you watching from around the world, it is a miracle to be able to tell you that the last thing he saw with open eyes in this life was our victory in that race and the passing of the political torch. But what we three get to share with you today is something entirely different. Something that others saw very little of, Stephen Lewis as a dad. The private guy, in his office at home with a ball game, a thriller, or a rom-com on the TV as he worked away night and day. Yes, in his latter days, he was a rom-com superfan. Notting Hill at least 17 times. He loved licorice all sorts. In an earlier era, he smoked cigars, Swisher Sweets or Old Ports, the cheapest, sweetest, and foulest cigars to be found on this blessed earth. You could always tell when Dad was typing in there by the shaking of the foundations. He was a two-finger typist who pounded out texts as if it were the system itself he was trying to shatter, rather than just an innocent intermediary keyboard. Dad adored music. As a child, he was a piano prodigy, and though he never kept it up, in his 70s, he could still do a credible job of the histrionic opening to a Rachmaninoff piano sonata. Hair flying, notes pouring from his stubby digits, nails gnawed off decades earlier. He had a theatrical penchant for the grand gesture on a personal scale. We'd be celebrating a birthday or a special occasion and bemoaning his absence on yet another work trip, when suddenly he'd be walking through the door, suit bag slung nonchalantly over his shoulder, having found an impossible connecting flight overnight to arrive just before the candles were lit on the cake. When Ilana was 3, she asked for a llama for her birthday. A nice, soft, stuffy llama? Mom said. No, a real llama, Ilana insisted. Months later, Dad was in Montreal for a speech. It was always for a speech. He saw a classified ad. After Expo 67, they were selling the animals from the Biosphere exhibit. He rented a very long truck. There's a current family debate. It may have even been an 18-wheeler. No idea how to drive it. He showed up at home with a raccoon, 2 sea tortoises, and a full-grown llama. Naomi did not believe this story for about 20 years. Photographic evidence was produced. It is a true story. Dad was fanatically loyal and supernaturally supportive. He shared feedback for every one of Mom's columns, the draft columns, for 5 decades, no matter where he was or what time zone. Mom still has the number for the fax machine at the Addis Ababa Hilton. He was a person of unshakable principle, in whom the personal and the political were but hemispheres of the same inner globe. In 1965, he bought a cottage and sold it a few years later for exactly what he had originally paid. He didn't believe in real estate speculation. For his entire life, he paid as much income tax as he possibly could. Yeah. Which is no mean feat for a guy who practiced deficit financing on the personal household level. He regarded entirely legal deductions as somehow suspect. These were not performances. He was just clear and constant to the point of belligerence when it came to his own moral code. I wish I had time to share every wild story. He could dry start off a dock on water skis, do a round of the lake, step out of the skis and back onto the dock, a cigar clutched between his teeth the whole time, remaining fully lit. But more than anything, I want to share something that you all already know. A quality he had that more than any other taught me what it means to be a good person. It was his generosity of spirit. He helped people like he breathed. And this impulse was deeply democratic. It sought no advantage, nothing in exchange. He had a second sight for the light in people, the spark of purpose, idealism, commitment. And he considered it his responsibility to help however he could, to blow on those embers, extend his own networks, advocate. I think he probably boosted hundreds of careers. Why? Because he could. Because he was anchored in the world by the iron cable of his own sense of justice. He moved through life in a state of rage at unfairness, the depredations of capitalism, he would say, and a simultaneous passion for human fulfillment, for the right of every person to live a dignified life, find their place, and have a chance to contribute. His was a socialism of the heart. He had plenty of flaws, of course, but today only one of them matters. He never wrote it all down. So in the absence of the memoir we always begged for, and in fevered anticipation of those 22 hours Suzuki's sitting on, I leave it to you all. Please keep telling the stories about him that you know. That's where he lives now.
When I was about 16, we were living in New York as Dad was at the UN. He had just come home from a trip to New Zealand. Right or wrong, I was expecting some gifts. But that expectation was set by Dad Over the years, he had set a standard of always bringing something home with him. Tea towels, sculptures, spoons, plates from China that were so large they needed a custom box. And this time, hotel soap boxes and a tin of Band-Aids. He told me he couldn't really get me anything, but grabbed a few things. I went down the long hall to my room and cast upon my bed were the soaps and again, a box of Band-Aids. Thanks, Dad. I sat down trying not to feel ungrateful. He had thought of me when stealing soap from all the hotels. I figured I'd open one. Inside was not soap. Instead, it was a sparkly pair of purpley dangly earrings wrapped carefully in Kleenex. I took a moment and counted all the boxes on my bed. 49. I realized that every box had a carefully chosen piece of jewelry, lovingly wrapped in tissue. That was Dad, traveling the world and changing lives and thinking of us back home, finding little gifts that would delight, fanciful or silly, but always finding a way to connect with us while far away. Dad had a gift of being so present when he was with you that the time apart never felt that distant. He also had a way of making things feel special, waking me up in the middle of the night. Okay, it was probably 9 p.m., but I was little, so it felt like adult late, to watch My Fair Lady with him in his workroom, wildly conducting along to his favorite concerto in the living room. Avi said this, his hair flying in time to his enthusiastic hand movements, like a character out of a British novel. He was full of surprises. He could throw a bowling ball and take out that one pin left on the side. I found out as a teen that he had worked at a bowling alley placing pins from above before they had machines to do that job. Artfully paddling me and Mom in a canoe on a weird roadside river somewhere between BC and Oregon. We'd just come from Avi's marriage and we were wedding and we were driving to my school in Oregon. Buying a house without making it past the front hall. How many bedrooms, my mom anxiously asked. We have 3 children. I have no idea. He said, your mom told us to buy it, so I did. His notes to school when we were sick, the Shakespearean plague-like details, became legendary. He would drive in reverse the wrong way on a one-way street while we traveled in Europe and yell out the window, "Don't worry, we're Canadian," as if that explained it. He was never embarrassed. He would enjoy every minute of being ridiculous and making us all laugh. But his crowning pleasure was attaining Zeta status. As you can imagine, getting to tell the worst jokes and watching his grandchildren, Zev, Yoav, Zimri, and Toma, groan and fall to the floor in gales of laughter was pretty much the best thing ever for all of us. My whole life, I kept finding out new details about Dad's life, from his friends, articles, newspapers. He clearly did so many things and had so many profound connections to so many people in all walks of life. But I will always remember him as my generous, silly, irreverent, supportive, and corduroy suit-wearing dad.
I thought I was the one who was going to cry. Okay. Many of you know the story of the Stephen Lewis Foundation, how my father, devastated by what he saw as he moved from one cataclysmic moment to another in the lives of tens of thousands of people in families and communities across the African continent in the early 2000s at the nadir of the AIDS pandemic, how the foundation was really born out of his despair, his refusal to accept the stasis and neglect of the international community, how intolerable it was to him to see African women struggling to keep families and communities alive and together with little or no recognition or support. Their suffering and tenacity haunted him. Joining him for 17 invigorating and luminous years was like plunging into my father's fiery operating system, urgent and indefatigable. I watched him powered by incendiary outrage, and it was like he was incandescent with it. He carried with him every story, every face, every child, every grandmother, every AIDS denialist, every delinquent politician, diplomat, every activist and author. I marveled at the way he refused to buffer himself from pain. It took my breath away. And at the same time, his modesty could be so damned infuriating. Ilana, he said, leave the UN and start the foundation with me. I wanted to call it the Stephen Lewis Foundation. He was appalled. What then? We'll call it the Grassroots Action Foundation. Dad, I'm not leaving my excellent UN job to be the executive director of GAF. Oh, Ilana, he said, you're the only one who cares about acronyms. No, Dad, you're the only one who doesn't. And thank goodness for David Suzuki, who somehow made the idea palatable. And his profound pleasure in seeing others, as you've heard so much today, particularly women, step into the fullness of their potential. It was never singularly about politics. It was about a deep human connection through work in common cause. That's why it's so hard to separate the father from the comrade, the personal from the political. Because with all the fiery, inspiring oratory and totally uncanny capacity to amass and retain damning facts and figures, there was humor and light and mischief and genuine affection and care. And when I came out, he did a little dance in the front hall of our home. And he sang an aimless, ridiculous song about my finally being a lesbian. I won't repeat it for you, it was too silly. He put a picture of me and my partner in his UNICEF office, and with a twinkle, he would mortify any conservative government official who met with him by beaming at them and proudly pointing out that this was a picture of his daughter, who also worked in the UN, who was, if they hadn't noticed and appreciated adequately, a lesbian. It's true. And when I was agonizing over which sperm donor to choose, I called my dad, of course, and he met me at a deli between our offices in New York. And he meticulously reviewed each of the profiles with me, and we ultimately agreed on the same donor. And he gave me a long, joyful hug. And he walked off jauntily, saying over his shoulder, just remember, AI isn't artificial insemination, it's anticipated infants. And how he adored them when they arrived, Zevin Yoav. He took the time to share his sense of urgency about equality and human rights. Discussions of democratic socialism and feminism abounded with their grandparents. And he took every opportunity to learn who they were and to tell them how eternally proud he was of them. Many of us today have tried to capture how he really saw people for who they are, not objectifying them, not glossing over disparities or different realities. He was truly disgusted and outraged at the core when anyone was treated badly, whether individually or systemically, because of who they are, or who they love, or how they identify, or where they're from. Every person was seen and valued, precious and necessary, dignified and deserving of a voice and an unflagging ally. And as a father, he communicated that love of humanity, compassion, and the deep desire for each of us in our own way to join him in the struggle, and through it, find sustenance and meaning in life, join in his impish hilarity, and use the absurd and our conviction to keep defeat at bay and never, never give up on improving the human condition.
So I'm going off script for a little minute, just a minute. I have a great-grandmother and grandmother who attended every funeral they could. whether they knew the person or not. That's irrelevant. Every life needed to be honored, and they made themselves present. And my grandmother would come home and offer observations. And she was always critical that, and state, and I'll do it in Jamaican and then a little brief translation. Me go on enough people funeral and hear them talk about the somebody and wonder, who them I talk about? Translation, I go to many funerals, and when I hear the eulogies and the memorials and the testimonies, I wonder, who are they talking about? So she always cautioned that whichever gathering I attended, I must speak the truth about the person who lived. And what you have heard today are the many truths about Stephen, the man who lived. Michelle, I give back to you a word you gave to many of us when you talked about the social justice work in this city, when you used the word palpable goodness, when you saw right things being done. And I give this word back to you and this phrase back to you. You would write about Stephen's palpable goodness. Thank you. And last but not least, off script, is I was given permission to disrupt, and Stephen was about disruption and protest. So, for Michelle, for Stephen in this room, when I say no more patriarchy, what do you say? When I say no more patriarchy, what do you say? Come on, my sister feminist. When I say no more patriarchy, what do you say? No more patriarchy. Thank you, thank you. Stephen Lewis, you have left us when the monsters all over the world are talking to each other. As stated by Natalie Diaz, a Pulitzer Prize-winning Mojave American poet. However, you have left us with tools and conviction that it is our moral imperative to be unrelenting in pushing back against the monsters who make cuts to health care for the most vulnerable, who create politics and strategies that entrench patriarchy and structural inequalities, and who weaponize fear to wage wars. Thank you continually, Stephen, for giving us language, tools, and introducing us, I say, grand eloquence, Theo said, genius of words, to make visible the systemic and structural inequalities we experience and witness, and for the way you inspire us to act with purpose and urgency to change and challenge those conditions. As a gift, I give some of those words back with thanks and laughter amidst grief. Stephen asked political leaders at the memorial of Jack Layton to conduct politics in a different way and to put an end to quote, to end to the rancor of vituperative practice of the political arts. Yes, end to the rancor and vituperative practice of the political arts. This moment of bile in politics demands that we heed his words. When Stephen asked at the 2002 Group of 6 Billion People Summit in Calgary, why is the war against terrorism sacrosanct and the war against AIDS equivocal? Those listening, I am sure, had, like me, a call and response moment with us saying, "Yes, Stephen, tell them," as this was the reaction Stephen generated from each speech. Even at board meetings at the Stephen Lewis Foundation, where after his delivery, we all wanted to take to the streets in protest. We all wanted to make a donation to make resources available to fill gaps. We all wanted to dig deeper our commitment to make communities and the world around us a place that holds care, dignity, and equity for all. Those are things Stephen's speeches inspired. I recall Stephen's remarks at the 2016 NDP convention, yes, Avi, before, where he enlivened the convention with a speech that had us thinking that he was about to throw his hat in the ring once again. There he denounced the then federal government's position on climate change as a superfluity of twaddle, and predicted hallucinatory climate convulsions in the years to come. And then to top it off, he characterized Trudeau's sunny ways as federal. Well, many of us ran to our dictionaries after his speeches, not begrudgingly, but with glee that we were about to learn something new. That is what Stephen leaves us with, glee and a zeal to act now with purpose for liberatory changes. In closing, the last public protest Stephen took part in was, as you heard, his attendance with Alana and others at 7 a.m., an anti-genocide protest in his old riding of Scarborough West in May 2025. It is therefore fitting to end with poetry, as it is often the artists who imagine a world we cannot see where the monsters are defeated. This is a poem from Palestinian writer and poet Mahmoud Darwish, and the poem is called Think of Others. As you prepare your breakfast, think of others. Do not forget the pigeons' food. As you conduct your wars, think of others. Do not forget those who seek peace. As you pay your water bill, think of others, those who are nursed by clouds. As you return to your home, think of others. Do not forget the people of the camps. As you sleep and count the stars, think of others, those who have nowhere to sleep. As you liberate yourself in metaphors, think of others, those who have lost the right to speak. As you think of others far away, think of yourself. Say, if only I were a candle in the dark. Let us leave this gathering to be like Stephen, a candle in the dark. We close with Stephen's words, ringing sweetly and insistently in our ear. And we're asking, and I am asking, and all of us who have spoken are demanding, that we carry his candle in the dark. Thank you.
I'm going to do something profoundly and disconcertingly unorthodox. You have occasionally interrupted with ripples of applause. The screen in front of me says your time has run out. Please sum up. I have 2 or 3 other things I'd like to say. Do I have your collective permission to say them? Finally, in my view, as delegates doubtless know, the most vexing and intolerable dimension of the pandemic is what is happening to women. It's the one area of HIV and AIDS which leaves me feeling most helpless and most enraged. Gender inequality is driving the pandemic, and we will never subdue the gruesome force of AIDS until the rights of women become paramount in the struggle. Last Monday morning at the Women's March, the signs read, "Women's rights are human rights." That was the slogan that captured the Vienna International Conference on Human Rights in 1993. It was the slogan repeated at the Cairo Conference on Population in 1994, and yet again at Beijing in 1995. It's never been made real. And so long as men control the levers and bastions of power, it never will be real. Whether it's the apparatus of the United Nations, including the agencies, or the endless number of high-level panels or auspicious studies of human development like the Blair Commission on Africa, the demeaning diminution of women is everywhere evident. And those examples are but proxies for the wider world, particularly the developing world, where freedom from sexual violence, the right to sexual autonomy, to sexual and reproductive health, social and economic independence, and even the whiff of gender equality are barely approximated. It's a ghastly, deadly business, this untrammeled oppression of women in so many countries on the planet. My closest colleagues and I have come to the conclusion that one of the ways to diminish the impact of the AIDS virus is by creating a powerful international agency for women, funded and staffed to the teeth. There must be voice and advocacy and operational capacity on the ground for 52% of the world's population. There is a UN reform panel at the moment contemplating the creation of a new entity, provided they have the courage to confront the warped and abysmal gender architecture of the United Nations. If they find the courage, I deeply believe that we could begin to still the carnage. And what works for AIDS can work everywhere. I challenge you, my fellow delegates, to enter the fray against gender inequality. There is no more honorable and productive calling. There is nothing of greater import in this world. All roads lead from women to social change, and that includes subduing the pandemic. For my own part, when I leave the post of envoy at the end of the year, I have asked that my successor be an African, but most important, an African woman. Thank you.